Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Z, and welcome to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. Today, I am joined by somebody who I greatly admire, who I think is absolutely brilliant, Vanessa Reiser. Vanessa is a licensed psychotherapist specializing in narcissistic abuse and cult abuse. She is also the founder of Tell a Therapist and is best known for her run across the state of New York, 285 miles in 11 days, to raise awareness for narcissistic abuse, and she ran it in her wedding dress. Her insights are both personal and professional, giving her a unique lens into this insidious form of domestic abuse. Vanessa has been interviewed by prestigious news and media outlets like People Magazine, the New York Times, MSN, and the New York Post. Most recently, Vanessa has authored a book, Narcissistic Abuse, a therapist's guide to identifying, escaping, and healing from toxic and manipulative people. And this book comes out this month of October. We're going to be discussing today coercive control. We're going to be talking about cults, but also cults of one or cults of five, and how mind control pretty much operates the same as it does in these larger grand scale cults. I think you're going to find this episode extremely interesting. And hopefully get some strategies on how to navigate a situation that you may be in that sounds similar. Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Z. Welcome to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. Today, we have someone who I look up to very much for all her expertise in the world of narcissistic abuse. Vanessa, thank you so much for being here. And you are also a recent author. And before we even get started, I want you to tell everybody about your book, because we're really going to focus on the content of your book, but more so because it's a very specific topic that I don't think is touched on enough. So I'm going to hand it over to you. Introduce yourself, introduce your book, and we're just going to get right into it.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Reiser. I am a licensed clinical social worker practicing in New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Florida, specializing in narcissistic abuse. And I did just write a book. It has been published by Hachette. Very proud of it. It's called Narcissistic Abuse, a therapist's guide to identifying, escaping, and healing from toxic and manipulative people. It comes out October 29th. And this book is unique because it aims to fuse the concepts of narcissistic abuse and cult abuse. So we talk quite a bit about mind control and this idea that people can be so highly manipulated that they wouldn't even realize, that they were in a cult of one, a cult of a few, sometimes in a family system, or a cult of millions, as we see in some political environments. And so that's really the idea, is this overarching theme of mind control.
So for people that are listening that may not understand the nuances of mind control, when we talk about cults, I have a feeling that a lot of people are thinking these kind of large groups that live on communes and it's this kind of, you're sucked in and you don't realize you're in it, but then you just kind of get into this mix of large groups of people that all believe in the same ideology, and they're kind of conditioned into that. They're groomed, they're conditioned, and then you have this mass amount of people. But it's not always that. And I think that's one of the things that I really want people to learn from this, is that a cult isn't just that. Can you explain to people, just to start, kind of how mind control works and why that idea of a cult being these, 50, 60, 100 people living in a commune is not necessarily all there is as far as cults go?
Yeah, every cult, whether it's a cult of one in a loving partnership or an interpersonal relationship with a lover, I'll say, is led by a narcissist, a sociopath, or a psychopath. Hard stop. We sometimes joke about, different cults with different bands, or those are not cults. Those are, certain cultures. But a real cult is always led by somebody who's trying to control and groom and manipulate others to get supply and attention. So we do see this in intimate relationships. We see it in families. And what they're doing is they're using the classic tactics of the narcissist, to manipulate others to do what they want. They will isolate. They will get you to basically only view their opinions. We saw this in the Scientology cult, where Tom Cruise was disallowed from seeing anything in the press. And we see this in family systems where, you're being fed information and you're being told not to look at potentially social media, or somebody may take over your social media, so that you are only going to be subscribing to their narrative, their optics, what they want you to understand. So it's very hierarchical. Like, this is somebody who, an abusive, leader of a family system, is going to control everything ultimately about what you see, what you do. They might busy you so that you're just distracted from seeing things. All of it is grooming. And yet we don't think of cults as being family systems or intimate relationships. We think of this happening somewhere like in the middle of nowhere. And the people are, kind of duped and are following some religious experience, which is not always the case. Oftentimes the communal narcissist does hide behind some kind of, theory. And it could very much be a universal guru environment, but that is not what this is. This is about, mind control. And it happened to me. It happens to educated people. I consider myself as having been in a cult of 1 or 2. And I never thought I was going to show up and be in a cult. But when it clicked for me, it really clicked. And that's why I wrote the book. It was like when I was talking to Mark Vicente from the Nexium cult is when I had an aha moment. I thought, oh my God, I was in a fucking cult. I cannot believe I ever thought I'm like this piss and vinegar, kind of loud mouth, just very independent thinker. And then there I was. And so this idea that you have to be in a large organization to be in a cult is a misnomer, period.
Right. And I think you bring up a couple good points. One, you're clearly very intelligent, right? And I think this shows people that it has nothing to do with intelligence at all. It really doesn't. And the other thing is that there's this misconception that those people that get sucked into, quote, these cults, whether it's a cult of 1 or within a family system or on a larger scale behind, hiding behind a religious organization, that people, it's a myth that people who have low self-esteem, no backbone are the ones that get sucked into this. That's not true. As you just said, you were this independent, opinionated, strong-willed woman, and you kind of got into this. And so it's important for people to understand that it has nothing to do with intelligence, and it is a myth that you're this weak person. I think where that comes from is that once you are in this cult, whether, again, cult of 1 or whatever, the whole point is to gain control and power over you. And with that comes this loss of self-identity. That's when I think people are viewing others saying, they have, no backbone or no opinion, or they can't stick up for themselves. Because at that point, yes, that's what has happened, but it is a slow process to that point. But again, this whole idea of this cult mindset, we think of as these larger groups, but again, that is not the case. It's a cult of 1 within a family system. I'm curious your thoughts on when you say you're in a cult of 1. Unless you are literally isolated from everyone around you, which happens to an extent, but obviously in reality, you are around other people, how much the narrative they give to others, right? They're flying monkeys. How much of that do you consider to be part of the cult as well? Because I would consider all of those outside people to be part of that narrative, right? And they groom their flying monkeys just as much as they groom, their partner in an intimate relationship. So how do you see that as being part of the cult?
Yeah, and you make really good points. It is extremely dynamic because they are constantly going and constantly scheming and coming up with plots and ways to manipulate others as well to do their dirty work. It's like an entire operation. when you really think about, even in a family system, how they will manage, how the neighbors view things, how they will manage, how, Aunt Barbara's going to see everything. Everything is so calculated. And you really, when you go through the portal of this and you look and you think about how fucking exhausting it must be to be a narcissist, because it is so much energy and work. I mean, I could never imagine how the sleepless nights of them sort of calculating and the gears going and the damage, and the pacing and then the note taking, all of the stuff that goes into this. It is an entire operation. You're absolutely right. So they are going to commission people to do a ton of their dirty work through all of the things that they've done to you in terms of grooming, manipulating, and coercing others. They may play the victim, of you. They may play the victim of others so that they can kind of get others to do all of their dirty work. And they tend to get really rich and powerful because they have no empathy. So they're going to climb the corporate ladder, and then they're going to have all of these resources to torture you with. We are seeing this with P. Diddy now in terms of like all of the people on the periphery that were either turning a blind eye or helping him directly to do that. So it's a big operation.
That's an excellent example, because it is such an operation. When you look at what was involved for years, this isn't new. I mean, this goes on all the time. And to see the level of detail that was used to manipulate everybody around him, even people you wouldn't think, I mean, we're talking law enforcement. It goes so far beyond just the people, quote, that were directly in front of him. In order for that, and I love the way you say operation, because that's exactly what it is. In order for these types of operations to exist, and not just exist, but be maintained, when it's so obvious, not to the people in it, but to the people outside, how damaging it is. The idea that it's been going on for so long, it shows you just how manipulative a narcissist can be, right? And so it goes even beyond the people that are even in the family systems. Let's say you're talking about somebody who's divorcing a narcissist. Not only is it the family and friends around as well that's part of this, but it's also it's the family courts, it's law enforcement. There's so many other players in this that the narcissist, in detail, very consciously does this to get their control and to maintain their control. And the lengths that they'll go to maintain that control is, for us, mind numbing, right? And I think this is where people get this notion of they can't know what they're doing. They can't know what they're doing,
right, because
it's
you can't put your mind around it, right?
It's so effing mind numbing to grasp that somebody is deliberately calculating in their evil. We can't wrap our heads around that. So it's easier to think they don't know what they're doing, or they got carried away, or they didn't realize it was that bad because everybody else was involved too. And that's bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we see the idea of them triangulating as a way to manipulate the flying monkeys too. So they might, do things like, right, Dawn, isn't that true? Or right, Joe? Like they sort of commission. And then what happens is Dawn or Joe, whoever they're trying to pull in to the fray to do their dirty work, is also intimidated by them because of the resources, because of the power, because of maybe they saw them barking on a telephone call and they thought, oh shit. Meanwhile, the narcissist is faking that telephone call. They're not on the telephone with anyone. They just want you to see their power. So they have a lot of things that are happening at the same time in order to get people to fall in line. And, unless you're really, really savvy, you're not going to see it. You're never going to outsmart them, as smart as we think we are. And I'm pretty good at this now. And Dr. Ramani and I have talked about this too. You're still, when you have empathy, you're still going to fall for some of their bullshit no matter what, because they've been doing it their entire lives. So it doesn't matter as good as you think you are at this. They have been doing this and they're really, really good at it. So you can't really sort of victim blame, this idea that somebody's going to have any onus around this level, like as we call it, an operation. is ridiculous. There's no way you could ever predict or know exactly what these people are doing. They're really, really, slippery.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point, is that and I'm sure you see this in your practice too, the level of self-blame and the level of, looking back and feeling dumb or feeling stupid that you couldn't have seen this, and then being uber hyper vigilant when you go forward and interact with people in the future because you don't want this to happen again. So it really, it's not, I don't want people to think that once they're out of this, that it's smooth sailing. Because when you think about cults in the typical kind of standard Hollywood version that we think of cults, right? There's deprogramming that has to take place when you're out, right? When we look at the next thing, there's deprogramming, right? You don't just come out and you're like, oh yeah, I'm good. I see this now and move forward. There is so many nuances to this deprogramming. So can you talk a little bit about the parallels between deprogramming from a cult and then deprogramming from a cult of one or within the family system, and how that, or family dynamic, and how that looks?
Yeah, so I'm learning a ton about the brain, and the brain is like a fact-finding machine. So it's looking for patterns, it's looking for facts, it's looking for truths. And what happens when you get gaslit and lied to over time is it's like a brain injury. You're kind of misfiring because you're like, what, this isn't 2 + 2 is not 5. 2 + 2 is not 5. Like, you're kind of, so you begin to spin. And so similarly, you're going to deprogram. The way you're going to do this, because if you have a neurotypical brain, like most of my clients do, and you have empathy, is you have neuroplasticity. So you can course correct. You can fix this. The narcissist will never be able to fix their corrupt disorder. It's a rigid disorder. There's nothing that I've ever studied.
Can you repeat that again, please?
Sure. There's no data that I can provide that the narcissist changes. It is a rigid disorder. But if you have a neurotypical brain, you can fix the trauma and the injury that you've experienced through the gaslighting and the bullshit. And what's really important to understand is that if you are outnumbered in a very large cult, it's even harder for you because you're looking around and you're like, it has to be me. There's 300 people that are subscribing to this shit. So they have the hardest time when people who have extricated themselves from a cult are trying to come to me. They are completely nervous breakdown, absolute horror, to the extent that I almost think I'm being prank called, quite honestly, because it doesn't even sound real. Some of the shit that they have experienced sounds like I'm being pranked. And those people are really, really in trouble. They are really struggling because that injury is so compounded. It's like you're the problem. It has to be you because everyone else believes this. And they will get bullied by, all of these cult leaders. However, if you have extricated yourself from the cult of one, even though it feels so horrible, imagine if you had hundreds of people that were doing that. At least there's only 5. I mean, some of these people who leave cults are suicidal. They can't imagine how to climb out of this hole. It is really hard when the numbers play a role. It's very scary.
And it's interesting because you would think that it's weird because one of the things that happens, as we know, with a narcissistic intimate relationship or a family dynamic where there's a narcissist, that there's a lot of secrets, right? And they're isolated from other people, whether they're isolated from friends outside of the family, we don't talk about anything that goes on in this house, or an intimate relationship where they slowly start to isolate you from your friends and family so they can have control over your mind and that you can't talk about the abuse, and so they can really lock you into their narrative. What's interesting, what you're talking about, when there's larger numbers, there's the appearance of this sense of this social support. But in reality, it's actually the opposite. It's probably even more isolating to be around all of these, 50, 100 people, whatever, or even thousands of people. It feels more supportive, even though it's actually more isolating because it's still that one ideology shared by so many. And I think that puts people, I could see how that would put people or bury people even deeper into this because there's so many more people around them that's viewed as support, right? And so to get out of that, you're losing support. Whereas when you're in these narcissistic relationships one-on-one, let's say, there is a part of you, and I hear this from my patients, that they know they've been isolated, and to leave that dynamic, they feel that they're gaining support in a way. They're breaking out. Whereas with what you're talking about, it's almost the opposite, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I've had a few clients come to me from the Hasidic community specifically, where they actually have to bail on their own children. They have to leave their own children behind because there's such a tight-knit community. And while community is a wonderful thing, obviously there's the potential for abuses in some communities. And so there have been stories I've heard that are really horrifying in terms of people having to, run and almost like cut off their arm to get away because and that is so horrible. I mean, to leave your own parents behind or your own children behind because they are also, in an environment that, they're kind of hook, line, and sinker. And so it's really hard for people to get out of some of these environments. It's particularly abusive. It's really horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't imagine, if you come to the realization of what's happening, right? And we see even again in a narcissistic marriage, just to have to leave your children behind, right? It's that bad, right? In order to have to leave your children, like, let's put this into perspective here. It's that bad. And for people that are listening, sitting here going, oh my God, wait, I never looked at this as a cult. It never occurred to me. And they start to kind of realize, kind of what you said, you have this aha moment where you're like, holy shit, this is the same process used in cults. Can you talk about because I can imagine people sitting here thinking about now, racking their brain, was that a cult issue? Because you don't look at it like that. We never use that terminology for these smaller dynamics. But can you talk about the coercive control that goes on in the very beginning and how it looks, how it's similar, and even kind of through to the post-separation, let's say, and what the similarities are and what people can maybe hang their hat on to say, yes, that was coercive control. I see that. Okay, I get that now.
Yeah, so you have the charming leader, right? So the charming leader is going to be peddling whatever they're peddling. They're going to love bomb you. So in a cult scenario, this might be telling you that you're special, that you have a calling. It looks like to me like you have an aura about you. You're going to, change people's lives, and we really need you to come on board because I've never met anybody like you. Blah, blah, blah. The narcissist does the same horse shit. And, people are eager to make a change. People are eager to feel connected to others. We are social creatures. Tons of data out there about what social environments feel like for us. And that's why people get so addicted to it, because it's like a drug. The dopamine gets kicked up when you feel connected, and I feel valued and validated and seen, heard, and cared for. So then we have the devaluing, which the narcissist also does. So these are moments where you might see the narcissist or the cult leader, the mask slip a little, and now you're kind of, the pedestal's been pushed out. You're not going to do what I wanted you to do. So there could be some kind of a silent treatment or passive aggressive behavior. And then you see sometimes, fighting or triangulating. They might put other members to kind of go after you, and give you a hard time. But the tactics are exactly the same because you're looking for that hit again to feel better. You're looking for, them to validate you again. And so there really is no difference between, being in a relationship or in a cult. And then, the post-separation abuse. We saw this a lot with Leah Remini when she got out of Scientology. I mean, death threats and lawsuits and just stalking and constant intimidation. And it was heavily depicted in, film and writings around what she suffered, having kind of exposed Scientology for what it was. But it's the same thing when you get out of a marriage. Now you're going to have the smear campaign where you're going to be in the family court system potentially, or you're going to be all of your dirty secrets that have been gathered while you were in this relationship. Similar to Scientology too, there was a lot of collateral gathering, a lot of, you explaining all of your darkest secrets so that we could kind of keep this in a vault. One day when we need to, we'll expose you for for who you are, heavy manipulation. The narcissist does the same things. There's video cameras in the homes of my clients right now, studying their every move just to exploit it later. So they have the same tactics. It's so eerie and so otherworldly. You would think they're having a meeting somewhere. Like,
I always say that.
it's
That's
so awful. I mean, you can't, it sounds crazy.
It sounds crazy. But I don't mean this in a conspiracy way, please, for those listening. But Vanessa will understand what I mean when I say this. For such nuanced behaviors, right? When we think about anxiety and depression, right? How I manifest anxiety may be different from me, how you manifest anxiety, but we get it, right? It's pretty much, I don't know, it's a little bit more black and white with that, right? Everybody manifests either somatic or they're worried or however that works for them. With narcissism, though, the behaviors are so nuanced. They are so complex, yet it doesn't matter who they are. It is identical across the board. And when you really think about it to the extent that it's just that it's so tiny, these tiny little behaviors, but the function's the same across the board. It's almost as if there's like a microchip implanted in all of them, and they all have the same program. And I mean, it really, I mean, I don't mean that literally, but it's probably to me one of the most, in an eerie way, like just like you said, fascinating things about this is that whether it's a cult leader who has 1,000 people or it's your ex-husband, it's the function of the behaviors is identical. And to me, that is absolutely mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing.
I think there are interesting parallels that I start to see between some of the schizoaffective behaviors or schizophrenic behaviors and also autism spectrum disorder, in that there's a rigidity that we notice. And that's probably what we're picking up on. It's like this copy and paste version. So we know that, and by the way, I'm not drawing an autism, deviant parallel, but there are parallels in terms of, we know that autistic kids are going to be very habitual and they're going to put things in line. They have certain patterns. And so the brain in some ways has some pathological behaviors. And this is what we're seeing. It is a pathological disorder. So I do draw parallels in the rigidity of it. And so that's why we're seeing this sort of copy and paste thing. And if you're science brained like me, I won't use the word evil, but if you're somebody who is into theology and other versions, it looks evil. Why? Because there's no empathy. That's what I think is happening, is this brain is corrupt. There's no empathy. So they develop ways to get supply at an early age that work for them, and they manipulate and they see, oh, this works. Let me do this. And so I don't think this starts magically as a teenager. I think this is something that we're assessing for in children in terms of sociopathy or oppositional defiant disorder in youth, where they're hurting animals, they're, setting fires. They're kind of, they're really eager to feel something. They don't feel much. So a lot of this is sport. And if you have no empathy, and you get into a position of power, which is really dangerous, just for fuck's sake, could just, start a war and so we really have to open up a dialogue around empathy and how to cultivate empathy in our cultures and be really mindful of it on a macro scale, because I'm glad that we're talking about this, but I think who we put into positions of power, who are like maybe interested in this cat and mouse game, it's not cute. It's not okay for the rest of us. And quite honestly, as a species without empathy, we cease to exist, because, the baby cries, the parent takes care of. If you don't care, then we don't go on. So we really need to talk about this. But yeah, it feels like a copy and paste because they figure it out early, and it's a rigid disorder.
And they're an expert at it. And back to your point about autism, and we hear people kind of misdiagnose sometimes because of the rigidity. But for people listening, what Vanessa and I are talking about is, on the surface, sometimes the behaviors look similar, the patterns look similar. The underlying function is totally different. Somebody who's a narcissist is, they lack that empathy. They are out to get power and control by whatever means necessary. They don't care what they do. as long as they get that. And so that's that difference is that the function is completely, worlds apart with that. But I mean, I completely agree with you. I think that it's this lack of empathy that really just, again, like you said, can look evil. From a neurological standpoint, there are reasons why that looks the way it does, obviously, and they adopt these behaviors early on, as you said, because it worked for them then. The problem is as you grow into adulthood and your context has changed and those behavior patterns are no longer necessary, but yet you never changed them, right? And then it kind of develops and morphs into this personality, this very rigid style.
Yeah. And I think the schizophrenic piece, the reason I bring that up, which I think is also, I've treated schizophrenics for years as well. And there's this delusion that I see in the narcissist actually subscribing to things that are completely not there. And that is a fascination of mine, is sort of the delusion, the heavy delusions around their fantastical thinking and how they actually believe a lot of the shit that they're peddling. And, if you've ever walked into somebody or met somebody even on the streets of Manhattan who's telling you that the CIA is maybe following them and they're, sort of troubled by this, you as a clinician, there's not a lot we can do other than hold space. We would probably, medical management would come into play in a lot of ways. And similarly with the narcissist, there's no point in sort of convincing them that their fantasy isn't real. So the rigidness again, and that's why I see little glimpses of certain pattern. And that's why I bring that up. I just wanted to kind of clarify.
Yeah. I mean, and even more so, the narcissist thrives on that. They enjoy it, right? Somebody who has these delusions, these paranoid delusions, they don't like how they feel, right? Like it doesn't feel good for them. Whereas with the narcissist, I mean, this is their bread and butter. This is what they thrive off of. So because a lot of this, has to do, for the people that find themselves in a cult, because a lot of this, when you talked about this, has to do with actual brain changes that take place over time, similar to a TBI or, any type of brain injury. When you get people coming into your practice and they're in this situation and they want help trying to get out of this, but the delusions that they've been sold and the narrative they've been sold are so deeply wired. What do you, and I'm saying this because I really want to get away from this idea that people have that just talking about it helps, because that doesn't work. So can you talk a little bit about what you do as far as emotion regulation and actually working with the brain changes that have taken place, and why this kind of circular talking about your experiences is helpful, but to an extent only, because you really need to make these behavioral changes?
Yeah, I think it depends on each person, but I think a lot of dialectical behavioral therapy, where we're kind of going to the five senses and, getting structured into their days, a lot of radical self-love and a lot of different inner dialogues that they need to get into. Because a lot of them have developed that, sort of they blame themselves, or they have been devalued for so long. A lot of them do need to talk about it because they need to still process what even has happened. I tell a lot of my clients to journal, even just audio record themselves talking about it to sort of like express it. Because if you internalize this, it's particularly toxic. So I think people need to kind of get into some sublimation, even kickboxing, get angry. And they really have to forgive themselves for, whatever role they think that they've played in it, because it's not your fault. The narcissist has no type. They're just casting out lines like a fisherman. You didn't have the boundaries. You didn't know. It's not your fault. But I think a lot of it is for them to structure how to become empowered and how to love themselves moving forward. What does that look like for everybody? I think it's totally different. But you have to catch your cognition. Oftentimes, especially if you have a narcissistic parent, your inner dialogue becomes their voice. And so you have to kind of catch the horse shit that's in there and reframe it and sort of input more logical counter responses to the garbage that's now floating around in there. It's a lot of work to catch your thoughts. The hardest part is catching it. You can come up with all the things to put in its place, but you gotta get off autopilot and like think about, wait, did you just say this to yourself? What are you talking about? You're not stupid, as evidenced by the degree on your wall, as evidenced by this. Like, so we have to kind of gather data too, to sort of support whatever inner dialogue we're going to now input.
And I think that's why the expressing it and the journaling or the recording of it is so important, because it's not just, quote, journaling, right? The whole purpose of that is to get the thoughts decentered from you, right? So you're here and your thoughts and you're all kind of mushed together, but to separate the two apart so that you can look at it rather than it be part of you and start to pick out the patterns of the dysfunctional thinking, I think is super important. And then you can start to address that, because again, remember, people listening, once you're out of it, you still have to deal with all the post-separation abuse that occurs, whether it's a cult of 1, a cult of 5, or a cult of 100. So what do you tell people as far as they come to you and they have very little self-narrative that's accurate, let's say. And so over time, they start to build this narrative that they want about themselves back up. And they have all these people coming at them, trying to bring them back to their original positioning because that's what makes everybody else around them feel comfortable. What do you tell them? Because I get this question a lot when they're in therapy and they're working towards this, but they have a setback and they start to kind of teeter on the old narrative again. What's something that you could tell people who are listening that can help them kind of regroup if something like that happens?
I think they have to develop a list of things that they love about themselves that are not contingent upon how other people experience them. So this is almost a narcissistic exercise in some ways. And a lot of my codependent clients are particularly like fascinated by this. Or like, I can't come up with anything like I love myself. That sounds, especially women, because they're taught like, oh, you have to like be so giving and selfless and raise your children and don't ever have any needs. So they're like, whoa. But it is about empowerment. It is about autonomy. The narcissist is allergic to your power and your autonomy. They want to just groom you and keep you stupid. And, not in the know. So this is the biggest work, is to develop this list, but make it like a fluid and tangible thing that you study. You kind of have to make it a point. And, not everybody wants to do this kind of work, but you have to really make a list that you could even, bring your friends into deciding what makes you so great. It's a great exercise to ask people what they love about you, and people that are tried and true will come up with the greatest things. And it's a really emotional thing, but that's kind of like data.
That's so uncomfortable. It's just uncomfortable even hearing that if I'd ask people. What do you like? What's the best thing about me? Like, yeah. It's so uncomfortable.
Yeah, but the things you get back are really lovely. I did this exercise, and I remember my friend Jason was like, he went into this whole thing. That I remember the first time I met you, Vanessa, it was at a triathlon, and you walked up to me and you made me feel really comfortable. And I thought, that's really special, Jason. Thank you. You know what I mean? Like, you get these, you get great feedback. If you ask people that really love you and they're cheerleaders, you will get the most amazing. I did it with my son. It's really actually a special thing. And the reason why I like it, because even though you don't want to take only others' data, you want it to be internal. If you're really struggling, it is a great piece of evidence that some people might actually need just to kind of catapult you into the other stuff, because now you can see it. It's in your face. You can't argue with it.
I love that. So one last question. And then I just want you to kind of tell people where they can find you and your amazing work and your book and all of that. But for people that are listening, that are having this aha moment, or maybe kind of a pre-aha moment where they're listening to you and they're like, am I in a cult? I never looked at it like that. Oh my God, wait, what do I do now? What would you tell them?
Yeah. So if you're in an environment where there's a leader, whether they're covert and kind of vulnerable appearing or unassuming like Keith Raniere of the NXIVM cult, or you have a more overt abusive parent or partner and you want to move away from this, I think it's always advisable to do so, even though I'm not going to lie to you, it is hell to get out, absolute hell. Many don't even survive that process, I would imagine, in terms of suicide, homicide, drug addictions, whatever loss that they may experience. But I still think it's worth it because there is still a loss of self in this relationship. It is a relationship of inevitable harm. Do you want to waste 2 years going through the post-separation abuse, or do you want to sit with this animal for 30 years and waste 30 years? 2 years is coming with or without your help. 2026, October 1st is coming with or without your help. It's coming. There's nothing you can do about it. Do you want to be in this scenario still, or do you want to be in a new version of yourself where you can kind of do the work and have the rest of your life to enjoy and experience authentic relationships, which are phenomenal, and connection with real people, which is phenomenal and much better? I would say try to hide belongings, try to gather people that you can trust, try to get a plan in place, try to talk to people who understand what this is so you can get learned on what you're going through. Take off the rose-colored glasses. They don't change. There's no data that I can provide that says they do. They're going to tell you they will. They're lying. What do we know about narcissists? They're lying. But yeah, I think personally you have to get out. I don't think that I can coach anyone on how to stay in that relationship. I honor when people do for financial reasons and with their children. I honor it. But in good conscience, I guess I would say practice harm reduction and low contact with them. But it's a slow burn. It's death by a million cuts. And so to get a plan in place and to extricate yourself from a cult of one or many is always advisable.
Vanessa, this was great. You are brilliant and you are helping so many people. And I absolutely love talking to you and can talk to you for hours on this.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Can you, again, tell people your book, but tell people more importantly where to find you, where to find your work, where to find your book?
Sure. So Narcissistic Abuse, a therapist's guide to identifying, escaping, and healing from toxic and manipulative people is available at Hachette Book Group, also Amazon, Walmart, Target, and all of those fun places. And yeah, it's an important piece. You can share it with your friends or family members that don't understand it, judges, therapists. I put a block in there so that people on the periphery would also come to learn about what this is. I think that's really where the work is now. For us who are in this world, who understand it, we can talk to each other forever, but now we have to shine a light on this for the people who have not gone through it so they can understand it. So share this podcast, share the knowledge with everyone, because I think we're starting to, make a change and people are really getting a better understanding, I'll say, about what this is.
I agree. I'll post all of your links so people can find you, post your book so that everybody can get it. And again, like Vanessa said, this isn't just for people who have been through it. This is for people that have not been through it, so that if you get recruited as a flying monkey, you will see what's happening. And we can slowly limit the outsiders that the narcissist needs in order to thrive and get that supply. So this really is for everybody. Highly recommend you check it out. And again, I'll list everything in the show notes. But Vanessa, thank you so much. This was amazing, and we'll definitely have this conversation again.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. I hope you found it useful, but most importantly, I hope you found it validating. Want to work one-on-one with me? Visit my website at drjamiezuckerman.com to book a personalized coaching session, and be sure to check out my on-demand workshops on topics like co-parenting with a narcissist, life after leaving, anxiety management strategies, and more. Again, that's drjamiezuckerman.com. You'll also find links to my interactive workbooks, merchandise, resources, and newsletter sign up. Next Up Narcissism is as much your podcast as it is mine. I want to hear your feedback and what you want to hear. So make sure to leave a podcast review wherever you listen, or send an email to nextup@drjamiezuckerman.com. Again, that's nextup@drjamiezuckerman.com. Be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Make sure to tune in next week to see what's up next on Next Up Narcissism.